Hello.
We want to welcome Diane back. We want to welcome Dr. Abramson back. And this is the last of our 5-part series, but maybe next year, of course, when I say next year, I mean next Jewish year, 5783. We'll see. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Abramson back to Vancouver, and we hope that he'll be in Vancouver. And maybe you'll tell us something about your Jewish river tours and I actually am going to ask you about your book that we're going to be studying. Before we start, actually, I just want to mention, I'll mention it again later, that our Musar class that we've been doing over the course since the first day of the shutdown online, since the first day of the shutdown of COVID, but even after everything is opened up, we've continued on at 9:30 every 9:30, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And we're studying for just a half hour Musar. We took a small little deviation to study. We're just finishing up Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath. Oh, wow. And otherwise it's been traditional Musar texts. And now we're about to start studying a Musar text, even though it's called the Kabbalah of forgiveness. And maybe at some point, if you can give a little plug for our class and explain a little bit more about your book, we'd appreciate that as well.
Sure, Rabbi. Thank you so much for that introduction. It is thrilling to be back here. I feel like we've accomplished quite a bit, and I have exactly the great idea. If we do this again next year, maybe we should go back and do all the boring parts that we skipped over these 5 lectures. But why don't I start actually with talking about the book, because I am really excited about that particular book. It was something that made a huge difference in my life personally. The title, The Kabbalah of Forgiveness, is mine, but it's really a translation and commentary on a single chapter of a very thin and wonderful book called Tomer Devorah, which is translated as The Palm Tree of Devorah. Absolutely brilliant book of what is called Kabbalistic Musar, meaning, you can study Musar through many different approaches, through a philosophical approach, an emotional approach. So you can also appreciate it through a Kabbalistic approach. And I have quite a few lectures online if you want to, supplement the classes with homework and things like that. Basically, this first chapter of this book, Tomer Devorah, is it discusses 13 different strategies to forgive another human being. And it's amazing, even if you're not, like, I don't consider myself a person who especially holds grudges or anything like that, but after first encountering this book, I found that I was able to just totally cleanse myself of so many, corrosive things in my own past and background and relationships. And I find it of ongoing utility because I'm always dealing with people and saying, oh, wow, I need to use strategy number 7 for this guy. And number 3, you're it, right? And I find it really helps me kind of deal with the challenges in my own life by learning how to deal with other people in a very creative way. There's a deep amount of philosophy behind it, but it's also an extremely pragmatic work because he goes through each strategy. And then and this is the part that I think I expanded on a little bit, I provide a few sample scenarios of when, like everything from when someone butts in front of you in line at the supermarket and has more than 10 items in the express line to, someone who wrongs you grievously for years. How do you deal with that for yourself and, of course, for your family, your community, and the world as a whole? So I'm very excited and I'm very honored that you're going to study my translation and commentary of Tomer Devorah. There are quite a few, there's about maybe 3 or 4 English translations available, and it's kind of interesting to see how other people deal with it, but I'm very proud of this little piece. Okay, great. And the Riverboat Tour, so they're great. If you're curious, just go to kosherrivercruises.com. They're not too far from you. They're based in Seattle, and we go about as an organization, we go about 6 times a year. about 4 of those are specifically Jewish, and 2 of them are kosher, but not especially Jewish, like to the Amazon or to Antarctica, places like that. One day we'll have to have a cruise up to Vancouver Island. That would be wonderful. Okay, shall we get right down to our history then? So you were in the 5th section, of course, and I have divided these unevenly in terms of chronology. The first class that we looked at together was the ancient period, and we went through a good 2,500 years of history in the scope of 1 hour. Then the second class, we looked at the early medieval period, and that took us about 1,000 years. And then last class, or somewhere around then, we went up to about 500 years, and now we're just going to focus essentially on 1 century. And I call it the Jewish century because there was just so much of tremendous consequence in this Jewish century, the 20th century that we have just passed. In many ways, we are still in that century. Like we can refer to it as kind of as a long century because it extends from the 20th century into the 21st. But let's have a look at it. So basically, the 2 major events that are like incomprehensible that they should happen at all in Jewish history, but completely amazing that they should happen so close to each other in the middle of the 20th century that it leaves me reeling when I ponder the larger significance of it. Okay, let's dive straight in. So if we go first to World War I and its aftermath. World War I broke out actually on the unluckiest day of the year, Tisha B'Av, the National Jewish Bad Luck Day that commemorates the destruction of the temples. It was actually a series of events around Tisha B'Av, one of the great high school essay topics that you may have even written on yourself, and maybe children and grandchildren as well, is what are the origins of World War I? Very complicated, involved and kind of stupid diplomatic commitments to follow each other into war, and they kind of tripped over it without realizing it. And at the end of 4 years, Europe emerged bloody and bruised and wondering what was it all about. Led to a tremendous crisis of philosophy and of society, and led to what some people call the lost generation, simply because people, could not comprehend how they were to integrate the horrific violence of that era into their lives. Have a look at this map here, which is one of the most tangible pieces of evidence of the upheaval of World War I. On the left, you can see that East Central Europe in particular is dominated by 3 great empires: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. These are basically early modern empires, and 4 years later, they were totally gone. Look on the right, and you can see that Germany is chopped up. It's still intact as a state, but it has lost the little bit which is labeled here East Prussia, and actually should be the same color as Germany. And they're separated from each other by a bridge of land formed by the new country, Poland, that has been resurrected after 200 years of absence since it was last removed from the map by its neighbors. To the south, Austria-Hungary is almost disappeared. Once this massive country that spans so many different cultures and languages and religions, now it is chopped up into a whole bunch of pieces. Austria itself and Hungary are just tiny rump states with 2/3 of their former citizens living outside their boundaries. Hungary goes through so much change that in World War II, they would be led by an admiral, Admiral Horthy, and of course, it's landlocked. It has no outlet to the sea. It's absurd to have an admiral in a country that has no outlet to the sea. And then, of course, the Russian Empire goes through a tremendous series of revolutions and civil war that results in tremendous bloodshed. And in fact, Jews in particular suffered from the upheaval of the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, with the chaos and the anarchy wreaking havoc throughout, in particular, Ukraine, but also Poland and Lithuania, Belarus as well. Pogroms, just widespread attacks on civilian populations, primarily Jews, who were the most obvious target, but also other minorities such as Poles living outside of Polish territory, or Mennonites, who in particular suffered in this era because they were pacifists and they would not fight off the pogromists. Took tens of thousands of lives. And in fact, one of the great ironies of this period is that were it not for the Holocaust, with its overwhelming devastation, then this period from 1917 to 1921 would have been the worst era of violence that the Jews had experienced in 2,000 years. But hardly anyone even thinks about it because of the shadow that the Holocaust casts on this entire period. But I'm going to skip just a little bit past this to look at the Soviet Union in particular, because one of the things that happens is that of all these various armies that are fighting over Ukrainian territory in particular, including Ukrainian nationalists and Poles and pro-Tsarist Russians who want to bring back the Tsar, who at this time has already been assassinated along with his wife and young son, and a whole series of local warlords. One of the only bodies of troops that are able to control the violence against civilians is, believe it or not, the Soviet army, which is led by the Jewish leader Leon Trotsky, who we saw in our last discussion. And Jews realize that the Red Army is their best chance at stability, and so they become enthusiastic supporters of the communists. Not necessarily ideologically, although that does have a prominent rise in popularity among the youth, but the idea of the Soviets bringing back at least a modicum of order, which is the sine qua non of Jewish life. Jews cannot live in anarchic times. It's far too dangerous. We're too visible and too easily attacked. We need to have some kind of order. So they support the Soviet Red Army. And with that support and several other factors, of course, the Soviets eventually extend control over the region, driving out all the various rebel forces and extending their control over much of the territory, with the exception of Poland in particular. Now, once they get past their initial period where they try to artificially create a Soviet realm in this overwhelmingly backward agrarian society, they were trying to base it on Karl Marx's theories, which were heavily reliant on the idea that communism would develop in an urban society after going through stages of development like the bourgeoisie, democracy, and things like that. It would eventually mature into communism. But what the Soviets discovered is, all of a sudden they're in charge and they can do what they want, but nobody in the country knows what it is. So they tried rapidly to impose a kind of war communism, confiscating grain, collectivizing agriculture, shutting down synagogues, churches, mosques, actually blowing them up whenever they could. And they found that they had so much popular resistance, so they backed off it. They imposed something called the New Economic Policy, NEP, which lasted for a few years as they tried to slow down the pace of communism. And during this time, there was a political conflict between three major leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. And in the context of that conflict, which lasted throughout the 1920s, ultimately Stalin would emerge victorious. During that period where it was not entirely clear who was actually going to be ultimately the ruler of the Soviet Union, they experimented broadly with a lot of fascinating things related to Jews, the most significant of which is the establishment of something called the Yevsektia, or the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And basically, they got this idea that anything that was truly from the people, like their honest sort of expressions of their culture, as opposed to anything religious, which was kind of imposed on by the rabbis, or nationalist like Zionism. Except for those two things, anything that genuinely came from the people was worthy of support. And so they actually, in the 1920s, put a tremendous amount of energy under this man, Simon Diemenstein, who was a former Chabad rabbi who became the #1 Jewish communist of the era. They tried to recreate a sort of Sovietized Judaism. They rewrote the Haggadah such that Moses was gone, but Stalin was the hero, and Pharaoh became the Tsar, and they wrote everything in that kind of idea to try and convince Jews to accept this way of living. And the only really good thing of that period was that they really encouraged Yiddish. Yiddish, as opposed to Hebrew, was like the folk language, and so they encouraged the literature and the plays and poetry, and there was like for 10 years there was like an explosion of interest in Yiddish culture. Many Soviet Jews or many Russian Jews who were living in the States actually moved back because they saw it as some kind of Yiddish paradise. This lasted until Stalin was able to control things effectively in the 1930s. This policy, by the way, was something called korenizatsiya, which means routification, meaning put energy into developing the roots of a society, the koren, which in this case was Yiddish. However, they had their unique quirks as well. They established very early on something called the League of Militant Atheists. This is one of their publications on the left, Bezbozhnik. I couldn't find a photograph of the Yiddish language version of it, but it was called Apikoros, meaning the atheist. And they spent a tremendous amount of energy and time and effort trying to convince believing Russian citizens in the new Soviet Union to abandon their religious beliefs. They were actually rather successful for a whole host of reasons, mainly economic, and also riding on general waves of secularism that was definitely affecting Europe at this time. Among the major holdouts were the Chabad Hasidim, who for the duration of the Soviet period really did yeoman's work trying to keep Jews educated until the 1960s, when the refusenik movement, which we'll get to shortly, was to really expand. They also had a couple of experiments to try and rival the popularity of the Zionist movement, including at one point in the 1930s, they actually proclaimed a region of the Far East a Jewish autonomous oblast called Birobidzhan. And you can see it's located way out in the Far East. The main reason why they did this is because Zionism was really gaining quite a bit of popularity. Actually, from the very few election results that we have from this period, because there were some scattered elections held in Jewish communities, particularly during the revolutionary era, it appears that the plurality of Jews supported the Zionist movement. About 40% of Jews who voted were Zionist in orientation. About another 30% supported a communist party called the Bund that we spoke about last time we met. And then the third largest party was the Traditionalist Orthodox. The Traditionalist Orthodox and the Zionists, ironically, formed a coalition, and together they took up about 60% of the Jewish vote that we're able to determine. So those results give us just a rough idea how people thought of their political orientation, if they voted at all. But the appeal of Zionism, which the Soviets really detested, they hoped to try and stave it off by giving the Jews this autonomous oblast. Unfortunately, it was the initiative of President Kalinin, not the initiative of the head of the Communist Party, Joseph Stalin, and so he kind of shut it down and he slow-walked it. And especially tragically, during the period of the Holocaust, when it could have actually done some good for the Jews, he shut it down to Jewish immigration, so Jews were trapped in the West and close to the Nazis. But that autonomous oblast lasted as a Yiddish center all the way up until the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Moving to Western Europe, of course, the atmosphere in the interwar period is increasingly dire for Jews. The Germans were incredibly upset, not only with the loss of World War I, but with the humiliating way that they felt they were treated by the victors in the various peace conferences afterwards, imposing a huge war guilt clause on them, forcing them to demilitarize their border with France, and a whole host of other measures that plunged Germany into economic crisis. particularly in military circles and in the increasing conservative right-wing circles of Germany. There was this feeling that the Jews had somehow betrayed Germany with something they called the Dolchstoß, or the stab in the back. This is an example actually from Austrian propaganda. Of course, Germany and Austria were allies in the war, and they have very similar cultures, the same language, and so on. They would eventually join in 1938 in the Anschluss. And the image of the Dolchstoß here is, you see this lantern-jawed, steely-gazed Austrian soldier bravely defending the Western Front. But sneaking up behind him is this grotesque Jewish woman with clear, physiognomy of a stereotypical Jew, wearing a French hat indicating a traitorous nature, also with the Star of David in case you didn't get the specific Jewish message, and she stabs him treacherously in the back. This was tied to this notion that many Germans had that they should never have surrendered in 1918, that they were actually doing fairly well, especially on the Eastern Front, but it was Jewish pacifists, especially communists in Germany itself, that brought about the movement to surrender. And so there was a tremendous amount of hatred built up against the Jews, which Adolf Hitler was able to capitalize upon quite a bit. He was a true believer. He was radicalized in World War I in particular. He was actually wounded at the front through a gas attack, and he rode on this wave of anti-Semitism to power. On the left, you can see an Austrian poster that shows the image of the era. It said, there's actually a line cut off at the top. It says, "Vote Christian Socialists, German Christians, and save Austria." And of course, the images of the Austrian eagle there being strangled by this horrific worm-like Jew that is clearly bent on destroying Austria. This feeds into the whole idea of anti-Semitism, so popularized in the 19th century that the Jews constitute some kind of bacteria or vermin that specialize in destroying healthy societies, eating them out from the inside like a disease, only to leave the empty shell after and move on to a new host. Hitler attempted, strangely, to take over the government in a beer hall putsch in Munich. It was a terrible failure. They had lots of informants that knew the authorities knew that was going to happen, but he happened to meet with a very sympathetic right-wing conservative judge who felt that even though his, kind of insurrectionist approach was inappropriate, nevertheless, he had the right sort of motivation. And so he gave him a very light sentence, allowed him to have a personal chef in the jail, allowed him to have, we have photographs of him visiting with friends, wearing his lederhosen and sitting around a nicely appointed jail cell with, upholstered sofas and things like that. And in jail with a personal secretary, he dictated his memoir, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he essentially outlined his plans to rid Germany of its Jewish problem. It was deeply central to Hitler's Weltanschauung, his worldview, that the Jews were at the root of Germany's problems. And of course, he would act on them. When he eventually came to power, through democratic means, I teach the Holocaust to undergraduates, and they are always amazed that Hitler got elected in an advanced Western democracy. But that is, in fact, the case. He did not win a majority of the votes, but in the coalition politics of the day, much like in Israel, where no single party can gain a majority vote, he was able to legally be appointed to the head of the government. And once there, he used no end of dirty tricks to increase his power, ultimately arrogated for himself a dictatorial authority through the Enabling Act. In 1934, one of the very first acts of his government that affected the Jews directly was the establishment of this document, die Nuremberger Gesetze, the Nuremberg laws, also known as the laws of blood and honor, which were originally sketched out on the back of paper napkins in an all-night session with his deputies, where they strove to specifically define what do we mean by the term Jew. And this was crucial because Germany had a very significant intermarriage rate for about 50 years prior to Hitler's coming to authority. So you had lots and lots of people who were married to Jews, who had one Jewish parent, who consider themselves partly Jewish or at least friendly to Jews, and he needed to clearly identify who was Jewish so that they could impose the various restrictive measures that they're intending. So you can see on this particular image on the right, you have a full Jude, right, with 4 Jewish grandparents. Also a full Jew would be someone with 3 Jewish grandparents. And of course, they didn't deal with whether it was matrilineal or patrilineal. That was irrelevant. They're working within this kind of quasi-scientific racist notion. Then the column all the way on the left is the Deutschblütige, right, German-blooded, with no Jewish grandparents. And then the second and the third from the left are the Mischling of the Zweites Grade and of the Erstes Grade, mixed race of first or second degree, whether they have 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents. Ultimately, although the regulations were first directed at Jews, as the war wore on, anyone with 1 Jewish grandparent was ultimately caught up in its snares and liable to be sent to the death camps. But once they had the definition of a Jew as an operational principle, and you know, it's fascinating when you actually get into the history of this. One of the great scholars was Raoul Hilberg, who spent decades working in German archives and German bureaucratic documents. You know, with this kind of you know, clear definition, they are actually able to achieve a tremendous revolution in their society, a dark revolution, by essentially making it up to regular citizens to prove that they are not Jewish. And it was, you know, devastating for society, but I don't want to get too far off. Here's just a few examples of very small levels of ostracism, like benches that say "Nur für Arier," only for Aryan people. Jews are unwelcome here. Jews are unwanted guests, and so on. So clearly, in the 1930s, setting up a very, very, you know, unpleasant kind of environment. This would be, you know, perhaps the greatest moment of the Nazis during this period of escalation in the 1930s was that of Kristallnacht, an event that occurred, I'm sure you're familiar, on November 9th. It is the original 9/11, 1938, in which, after considerable planning, they released a what was purported to look like a spontaneous pogrom that killed about 260 Jews and destroyed hundreds of synagogues throughout Germany. And that was kind of like the last ringing of the bell for the Jews to get out of Germany. And 130,000 of the 500,000 Jews who lived there did in fact flee at that time. The real challenge was not so much getting the Jews out of Germany, because ironically, Jews were allowed to leave Germany right up until October of 1940. I mean, this is into the war itself. Jews could leave Germany if they wanted to. The only challenge is that so few countries would accept them, including a very, restrictive immigration policy here in the United States, and of course in Canada, an even more restrictive one. There's a very famous book by, I think it's Irving Abella, who the title was the quote from one Canadian immigration official who, when asked how many Jews could enter Canada, he said, "None is too many." That is in fact the title of this devastating book analyzing Canadian immigration policies. So Jews were kind of stuck between remaining in an increasingly inhospitable Germany and finding refuge anywhere in the world. Okay, so that takes us through World War I right up into the interwar period. If we go to the Holocaust itself, of course, this is in many ways the nadir of Jewish history. It was the most horrific period of persecution of Jews by far. I mean, in terms of scale, scope, its qualitative nature, it's absolutely incomparable. In fact, we struggle for the words to describe it appropriately. The term Holocaust, which is widely used, and the one that I'll use in our discussion today, is perhaps the most popular, but it also has a lot of ambiguities associated with it that are rather uncomfortable. It's actually a Latin term that's taken from the Vulgate translation of the Bible, and it is a translation of the Hebrew word olah, which means an offering that is completely burnt up. It is an offering that, as described in Leviticus, is something that produces a savory odor unto God, meaning that this reach nichoach, this pleasing scent of the burnt offering, is supposed to be something that God approves of. So using this, term that is laden with theological weight to describe the destruction of the Jews of Europe is off-putting. Does that mean that somehow, God forbid, this had divine approval? Does it mean, if the Jews, we presume, are the sacrifice, does that mean that the Nazis were the Kohanim, the priests? It's a very uncomfortable kind of term, although it has, gained currency. In Israel, they generally don't use the term Holocaust. They prefer the term Shoah, which is also Hebrew, also biblical, but it lacks that other characteristic. It means general destruction. My grandmother, she should rest in peace, Aleha Shalom, she used to use the term churban all the time, which was common to her generation. She was, of course, the generation of survivors. And churban, it means, of course, destruction, in the sense of, it's the same word used to describe the destruction of the temples on Tisha B'Av, in the 9th of Av. So that also has theological weight, giving but it's in a different direction. But anyway, I think I am digressing. The very first thing that Nazis do when they go to war in September 1939 is they begin to set up ghettos for Jews. Now, ghettos actually existed. In fact, Hitler put them in place from 1933 on, but the ghettos of the early period were primarily designed for his political opponents, communists for sure, political ideologues, journalists, thought leaders, all thrown into hundreds of camps that he established in Germany, which were more like kind of outdoor prison holding areas rather than the death camps that we'll talk about shortly. With World War II, however, as the hostilities broke out, he began to coalesce the Jews into quarters and ghettos. This was not necessarily deriving from Hitler himself. He had a very bizarre kind of leadership strategy or technique where he rarely actually gave direct orders. He preferred to, have his kind of leadership style emerge from the discussion of groups. So he would typically sleep in very, very late, sometimes into the afternoon. Then he would have these long dinner parties that would go late into the night, lots of smoking and lots of brandy, a lot of drugs as well. And and he would have his close associates around him, and they would have discussions. They would call it Tischsprachen. And he would kind of like nod in approval at the idea of one particular figure, and then everyone would get the idea, and they would become radicalized by each other just through these discussions. So the idea of the ghettos took quite a while to sort of coalesce. And in fact, the Nazis never really figured out what the ghettos were for. There were two particular philosophies that they approached, and they existed parallel to each other all the way through the entire existence of the ghettos. One school of thought was that the point of the ghettos was to be productive, that to use the Jews as slave labor. This was especially true in places like Łódź, which you see on the left there. They had a very skilled population of Jews with experience in textiles. And so they used the Jews of Łódź to make uniforms and linings of uniforms and blankets and whatever they needed for the front. And in that ghetto society, and by the way, the Nazis had a diabolical genius for kind of letting the Jews figure this out themselves, which is absolutely horrific. Maybe in the question and answer, we can explore that a little further. But as the Jews who were left to run their own ghettos in places like Łódź, having a work permit meant that you could be saved. You would get food rations and so on. If you lacked a work permit, then you would be sent to the chambers. On the right, you see a picture of Warsaw, where it seemed that the philosophy of the camp leaders there was that the point of the ghettos was to just starve the Jews to death. Simply, shut them up so they can't get out, and let them die of starvation. Jews in Warsaw were given a meager ration, it's kind of been using the word meager, of 150 calories a day, which is basically like a can of soda. That's the food they were given by their jailers. And so that meant that they had to turn to all kinds of smuggling and black marketeering and wherever they could to get material into the ghetto. As one particular scholar of the period who lived through the ghettos himself said, that if they would ever put up a statue commemorating the heroes of the ghetto, it would be a statue of a small child, because it was the children who would dart through the alleys and climb over walls in order to get food to bring it back into the ghetto. But of course, neither of these strategies would help the Jews, because when the Nazis determined that they were going to destroy the ghettos, it didn't matter whether it was productionist or attritionist, the ghettos were destroyed, as we shall see shortly. There's a major change in the war and a clear focusing of the Nazi intent that occurs in the middle of the hostilities. On June 22nd of 1941, a military operation called Barbarossa was launched. And this was essentially the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had been in a non-aggression pact with Stalin, which allowed him to secure his Eastern Front while he attacked the West. But his real aim was that once he had pacified France and the rest of the Western Europe, then he would turn his attention to his true goal, which was territorial expansion into Soviet Russia. Stalin was caught completely off guard, and they suffered devastating losses very early in the war. Why this is especially relevant for Jews is because the Nazis launched 4 mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen that marched behind the army, behind the Wehrmacht. And unlike the ghettos, which seemed to be kind of like chaotic, brutal, horrific, hellholes where Jews lived, the purpose of the Einsatzgruppen was to ensure that all the Jews they found would die. And they essentially were tasked with driving to each shtetl one after another, rounding up the local Jews and any other opponents of the Nazi regime, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, whatever other undesirables that lived there, marching them out to ravines, or having them dig their own graves and then simply executing them. This has now been called the Holocaust by bullets. It's a very large part of the Holocaust overall. Estimates range from 1.5 to 2.5 million Jews killed in this manner. However, for the Nazis, it was insufficient. There's a certain debate among historians as to why this change happened. Some historians argue that the Nazis moved away from the Einsatzgruppen murders because of the euphoria associated with their rapid advance into Soviet Russia. Others say that it was motivated by Hitler's realization that ultimately he could not control all of the Soviet Union, and that it would take some time, but that the Nazis would ultimately lose. So if they were going to lose the war, at least they would be able to destroy the Jews of Eastern Europe. For whatever reason, we don't know, in January of 1942, they had a meeting at a resort called Wannsee, in which they said, okay, we have a new technique now for murdering Jews. We're going to use gas chambers. This meant the construction of 6 specific camps, which were called in German Vernichtungslager, different from the term for concentration camps, called concentration camps in German. Vernichtungs means literally to make into nothing. And these were camps that were constructed solely with the purpose of taking Jews, living human beings, stripping them of anything useful on their person, including eyeglasses, gold teeth, prosthetic limbs, their hair, and then simply gassing them. And over 95% of the Jews who were deported to these camps from the ghettos throughout Europe were killed within 24 hours of arrival. A small number of them were retained to work in the various satellite camps that they had set up. For example, Auschwitz had a camp that worked on creating acetone, a chemical needed for the war effort, or for helping dispose of the bodies of their co-religionists. Absolutely horrific period, which of course is associated with the nature of the Holocaust itself. Auschwitz at its highest capacity could kill 6,000 people a day. Incomprehensible. And this proceeded essentially right up until the back of the Nazi advance was broken at Stalingrad and the Allies land at Normandy, and they slowly begin to crush Germany between those two vices. But nevertheless, it is in these 6 death camps that something like 2.5 to 3.5 million Jews lost their lives. Whew, okay, now it seems a shame to, well, we have to go on. The aftermath was one of, the Jews were stunned by the horrific demographic impact of the Nazi murder squads and the death chambers, with roughly 2/3 of European Jewry killed, 1/3 of world Jewry killed, absolutely devastating losses. But it is amazing to look at the speed and the ferocity with which the Jews attempted to rebuild their lives afterwards. About 300,000 were, for a brief period of time, gathered at these displaced person camps located in former Germany, in some cases even in former concentration camps themselves, and in Italy. And it's an amazing cauldron of activity of Jews as they're trying to build their lives together. I'm going to just go a little deeper for a minute here, just to kind of pick us up from the depths of despair. This is a document I found in the YIVO archives when I was doing some research there. It is chilling to see at the top the Star of David in the middle of the words written in Yiddish, Bergen-Belsen, which is, of course, one of the most horrific camps. It was one that was liberated by the Allies, and there were simply bodies of emaciated Jews strewn all over. The photographs are just horrific. This is a marriage contract, a ketubah, that was written in the DP camps. And as you can see, there are gaps left here so that it was mimeographed, an early form of Xeroxing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that technique, because there were so many marriages happening in the displaced person camps. Jews, sometimes widowed or from their spouses, were so anxious to get their lives back on track that they immediately married people, even if they didn't have a common language. They came from different parts of Europe, but they were so desperate to get on with their lives again. And the DP camps, some of which were dominated by Jews and actually had special Jewish sections, were filled with marriages. Here's one kind of chilling document that I also discovered at the same time at YIVO. This is another mimeograph document, which is actually a legal agreement that a husband would sign before getting married in the DP camp, indicating that he did not know the fate of his first wife, and he was marrying a second wife now, without knowing if he was a widower, which is technically possible in Jewish law. For women, it is not. And that was also a major activity of the rabbinical councils in the DB camps, trying to find any scrap of evidence to allow a woman to remarry when her husband had disappeared in the war. But in this particular case, because it is the nature of the prohibition on polygamy is different for men than for women historically, This document essentially says that the husband agrees before marriage that if his first wife shows up, rendering him now technically married to two women, which cannot be maintained, then he will submit to the authority of the Beit Din to determine what he has to do next. And it's amazing to me that this was such a common occurrence that they had to provide a form for every groom to fill out. Terrifying. And one last document from this remarkable era. Oh, the children born there. Wow, incredible. They had so many children born in DP camps, and the Jews there called them Mashiachskinder, meaning the children of Messiah, in the sense of that the Messiah, these clearly must be the times of the Messiah. And they wanted to make sure that their children were born to see that new era. Whew. One last document. Oh, here's the birth rates, by the way. You can see that on the left is all German women, including non-Jews. In 1920, had about 25.9 children per 1,000 women. And then as the economy tanked and war began, that number went down significantly. In Bavaria, for example, 7 babies per 1,000 women. But if you look at Bavarian Jews, right after the war, they shoot up to 29 babies per 1,000 women, exceeding even the roaring 1920s birth rate. And in 1948, they're up to 35.8 babies per 1,000 women, just indicating how dramatic their desire was to get their lives back and to begin raising families again. One last document that I find fascinating. This is an amazing document called the Survivors' Talmud. One of the things that the Jews in the DP camps complained of was that they had lost any ability to study Jewish texts. The Nazis had burned their synagogues, destroyed things, and they didn't have, for example, the Talmud. And so the American armed forces, amazingly, they took the Heidelberg print works, which used to specialize in Nazi propaganda, and on the same presses, they ran an edition of the Vilna Talmud, the Vilna Chas, which is one of the greatest printings of the Talmud of the time. And so that Jews in the DP camps could study them. I've actually seen this actual copy several times. The artwork is phenomenal. You can see here on the bottom, it has a depiction of, it looks like Sonderkommando, Jews picking up corpses and putting them into a cart to carry them away for mass burial. And on the top, it has the verse, I was almost taken away from the earth, but I never forgot your commandments. And underneath, it's labeled a labor camp in Ashkenaz in the days of the Nazis. And you can see the motif. This is a Talmud cover. I mean, it's amazing. This is a holy book, and they're putting these things there, but it really captures the feeling, the barbed wire and things like that. But as you move up the page, you see the Mediterranean images. And finally, at the top, a kind of image of a sunrise over a Mediterranean, maybe Jerusalem kind of scene. And it says underneath, from slavery to redemption, from darkness to great light. I always find this particular frontispiece very moving. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this race through the 20th century, it would be overwhelming just to study the Holocaust in one century. The fact that the Jews go from such an incredible, unprecedented devastation that is beyond really any other, there's no real comparable cataclysm in human history to what the Holocaust was. And yet within the space of a few years, they actually go to establish their own homeland after 2 millennia of exile. I mean, if you were to put this in a movie, no one would believe it. But in fact, this is what happened. Here's an image from 1870, the Western Wall. You can see a few interesting phenomena. First of all, men and women praying together. How did that happen? I don't know. But, and it's also, you can't see on the back end, there's actually a wall because the plaza was not built there. But the yearning for Zion, of course, is something that is age old in Judaism, easily 2 millennia old. In the 1880s, it begins to get a shift in the kind of attitude towards Israel, in which it was considered a place that was beautiful for pious people to go and live there, especially to be buried there. but it was not really the homeland that we could like resettle. But there is a burgeoning movement to try and organize immigration to Israel. This is one of the earliest documents of the earliest organized political movements called Bilu, Beit Yaakov L'chu V'ne'elcha. It's a verse in the Torah that says, House of Jacob, let us arise and let us go forth. And you can see they didn't even take it that seriously. They have all kinds of like doodling on it, but it is one of the formative documents that actually established Jews wishing to go back to Israel. The great hero of the period, of course, is Theodor Herzl, a very assimilated Austrian journalist who actually at one point considered mass conversion the solution to the Jewish problem, but was completely turned around when he saw how Alfred Dreyfus was treated in France in his trial. You recall in our last discussion, France was the first country to emancipate the Jews, to give them equal rights. And then 100 years later, Frenchmen are chanting death to the Jews in the streets over the accusation, which was incorrect, a false accusation of a Jewish captain of the army of treachery. So he decided at that point that anti-Semitism was never going away, and the only solution for Jews was to have a place of refuge. And that's essentially the model of Israel that he had in mind. It was not a religious model. It certainly wasn't like the high-tech powerhouse that it is today, but he envisioned kind of like a sort of Western country where all Jews could, if they needed to, but they didn't necessarily have to, but if they needed to, they could go flee to Israel as their refuge. He placed the last few decades of his life, and not even a few decades, the last 15 years of his life, at this cause, to the detriment of his health. He also had a very unhappy home life as well, unfortunately, and his children were also deeply unhappy after his passing. But he was able to really shift the needle and get Jews around the world and non-Jews thinking about the idea of allowing the Jews to establish a state in Israel. After World War I, with the redrawing of the maps that we started our class with tonight, that was also possible for Israel. So, compressing this history into a ridiculously short period of time, ultimately the British controlled it during the interwar period. A tremendous amount of friction between the British, the Jews, and the Arabs. Lots of Jews demanding to enter the land of Israel during the post-Holocaust period, and the rest of the world in sympathy with them. The British throw up their hands at some point and say, that's it. We can't handle this anymore. We're giving it back to the United Nations. Would you please solve this? The United Nations, and the British did this, by the way, in England as well, in India as well, which also left a huge mess between Muslims and Hindus. So the United Nations comes up with this rather bizarre plan to divide Israel into 7 unequal sections. 3 of them, as you can see on the left in green, will be given to Jews, which kind of corresponded to patterns of Jewish settlement. And on the right, you would have 3 of them given to Arabs, who were not necessarily calling themselves Palestinians at this point because pan-Arabism was more of a thing. And then Jerusalem would be an international zone that would be neither peoples. The Jews, of course, accepted it in May of 1948. The Arab nations around it rejected it, and war broke out. This was for the Palestinians known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, because it led to a large-scale flight of Arabs from the Jewish-controlled areas. And there's a huge amount of debate that goes on to this day, especially among modern Israeli historians, as to what motivated this flight. And there are more cynical than kind of traditional Jewish ways of looking at this, that it was motivated primarily by promises from other Arab armies that they would be able to return and take their homes and Jewish spoils and things like that. And other Arab historians point out, not without reason, that it's violence, and people flee violence in times of war, as we see in Ukraine for now. Wherever we place the assessment, and obviously there are huge political implications, what ended up happening is refugee camps for these Palestinians were set up in neighboring countries, which included Lebanon to the north, Syria, and Jordan. And Jordan, of course, at this point controlled what we would call the West Bank, and of course in Gaza. And these refugee camps still exist in many places, which is, on one hand, an ongoing, indictment of the Arab nations. Why have they not, dealt with now 3-4 generations of refugees? But on the other hand, it is an ongoing problem from Israel as well, because these Palestinians claim a right to return to Israel, which would wreak havoc with the Israeli state's Jewish majority. Israel is, however, able to survive that war of independence. And as you can see here, these 3 maps indicate how they're able to consolidate their territory, which was in itself rather miraculous. But the Arab states around Israel react quite angrily and expel their Jews in several places, leading to an even larger refugee movement among Jews that ultimately are successfully resettled in Israel. That's also another one of the many amazing miracles of the modern state of Israel. 1967, of course, is another major battle, which is one that is quite significant for today's debate over Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend much on this. But as you can see, the Jews in a preemptive strike, defending themselves against the Egyptian and Syrian armies that were clearly massing to attack the land, actually take over the Golan Heights, the West Bank, including the reunification of Jerusalem, which was just celebrated earlier this week. Jerusalem Day is the anniversary of that conquest, and the Sinai Desert, which they give back to Egypt in exchange for a peace treaty. Nobody wants, however, the West Bank and Gaza, which are hugely populated by unemployed Palestinians and represent a massive political problem for whoever takes it over. The Jordanians had, in the 1970s, suffered a coup that was unsuccessful from Palestinians, and they certainly did not want to become the owners of this territory, but they wanted some other solution of the problem. I'm going to skip over the peace treaties here, which I'm sure you're aware of, which resulted in the assassination of Sadat and the assassination of Rabin, but they were able to effect an ultimate peace, maybe not an ultimate peace, but at least some kind of peace with Egypt. The last thing that we should mention, though, is that Gaza here on the left, under Ariel Sharon in the early 2000s, he argued persuasively that the small Jewish settlements in Gaza were at huge risk and were very, very difficult to protect. And ultimately, it was a lost cause, and he abandoned Gaza. Israel disengaged from it completely, and it immediately elected a terrorist government into place, the Hamas government. And so Israel has essentially become a jailer of Gaza, trying to contain the elements within this extremely unhappy piece of territory with massive unemployment, because there are significant elements in there who would do Israel harm. And that's a problem that no one has been able to solve effectively. The demographic imbalance, of course, has changed with the massive number of Soviet Jews who moved to Israel. But now what seems to be changing, as I'm sure now we're getting into modern times, Israel is nevertheless making a lot of progress on the economic front. And even in the Trump era, where there was very little, overtures to the Palestinians politically, but definitely a lot of overtures to the Gulf states, which have been rather successful. Everyone also wonders, by the way, how does Naftali Bennett keep that tiny kippah on his head? It can't be any clips, but maybe some glue or something like that, double-sided tape. Okay, just a quick word on the USSR. Of course, it falls apart in the 1990s under dissident pressure, including that from Jews, resulting in massive waves of emigration to Israel, although there are still, hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Russia. Looking at America, which is, of course, the other big concentration of Jews besides Israel and the Soviet Union, America struggles, ironically, with the challenges of assimilation, which are proceeding apace in this country at a rate that, seems to outstrip even, it's an awful comparison, but the Nazi attempt to destroy the Jewish people. Assimilation is Jews doing it to ourselves, amazingly, and in a terrifying way. So much more to say, but we are really at the end of our time. So let me bring it to the very end. I tried in this 5-week series to give you the broad scope of Jewish history. And I think I have succeeded at least in checking off the boxes really fast. Make sure you talk about, the Babylonian exile. Make sure you talk about the Spanish Inquisition, right? We've done all those check. But each one of these periods is so rich with fascinating material that is still very personally relevant to us to this day, that there really are no boring parts in Jewish history. Everything is so fascinating. I'm grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to speak about it, however briefly and however concentrated in these 5 hours. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to discuss these things in much greater detail in the future. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone at Beth Israel, for your attention. And I'm going to bring this to a conclusion now.
I want to thank Dr. Abramson. This was absolutely tremendous. We also want to thank the Sarah Elias estate for making this all possible. And if you see Meyer Matic, who is the executor of the estate, please say thank you to him. And we are delighted to have had the opportunity to study with you online and hopefully one day soon in person. That would be great. And we also, just a reminder for those of you who were not here in the beginning, starting Wednesday of next week, we are going to be studying Dr. Abramson's book, the Kabbalah or his translation and commentary on an earlier Musar text called the Kabbalistic Musar text, known as Tomer Devorah. That is, the translation commonly used in English is the what was
the palm tree of Devorah.
The palm tree of Devorah. Thank you. The palm tree of Devorah, and it's part of our daily Musar study from 9:30 to 10 o'clock. So please join us online for that. No need to sign up, but you do need to purchase the book, and I can help you if you need to figure out how to find the book. And also, Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night, Saturday night runs into Shavuot this year. And so please join us as we join together with Temple Shalom and Harel for an evening of study and tefillah and good food. We're actually going to be studying text related to the halakha and the customs of some Jewish foods, including gefilte fish, challah, wine, and of course, cheesecake. And we're going to be consuming all of the above. One of the wines that we hope to have delivered actually tomorrow is the only kosher ice wine created in Ontario that's being shipped to us, as well as, of course, there's no better cheesecake in the world. And I think that you may know this, Dr. Abramson, there's no better cheesecake in the world. I think they probably talk about this in Brooklyn even, than Lissa Weinberger's cheesecake, who is my wife's cheesecake.
Ah, okay. I was wondering.
Yes. So anyway, I don't know if we have time for questions and answers because it's already so late, and you gave us so much to unbelievable. So we want to thank you, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to ask questions at some future point. And thank you all for joining us over this 5-part series. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Laila Tov. Bye, everyone.